Alice Grayson woke up at 6 a.m. sharp, as usual. The soft light of dawn filtered through the bedroom curtains, quietly flooding the room with warmth. There was no room for chaos in her life. Everything was in order, as if measured to the millimeter. She carefully climbed out of bed so as not to wake Daniel, her husband. His quiet breathing seemed to be the only soothing thing in the house, though it had been a long time since Alice herself had felt truly calm. She started the morning the way she always did, making breakfast, making sure the kitchen was clean, and checking her to-do list for the day. Scrambled eggs, toast, freshly squeezed orange juice, everything had to be perfect, just as it always was. After all, their life was just that, outwardly flawless. Daniel was a successful businessman, and many envied his achievements and how harmonious their family seemed. But something changed. Alice more and more often caught herself thinking that plays a role that no longer belongs to her. Her marriage has become something like a play, and the daily routine, just a stage set for this performance. Once she and Daniel had been really close, sharing thoughts and dreams, but it had been so long ago that Alice felt as if it had all happened in another life. She put breakfast on the table and sat down across from Daniel's empty seat. The table was set, the food in its place, but the house was strangely quiet. She glanced at the family photos hanging on the kitchen walls. Smiling faces, captured in moments of happiness. Their trip to the Grand Canyon, Daniel's birthday, their first wedding anniversary. But now those moments seemed like mere pictures with no relevance to the present. Daniel walked into the kitchen, slightly rumpled, but with his typical confidence. He kissed Alice on the forehead, not even looking her in the eye, and sat down at the table. Those kisses had warmed her soul before, but now they left only a cold feeling of emptiness. "Thank you for breakfast," he said in a casual tone, picking up the newspaper. His attention immediately turned to the news, and Alice was alone with her thoughts again. At that moment, it became especially clear to her that her life had become a semblance of what it had once been. They lived side by side, but it had been a long time since they had shared feelings with each other. Their conversations had been reduced to discussing Daniel's work or everyday household chores. There was no intimacy between them anymore, and that frightened Alice. How had they gotten to this point? In the evenings, after dinner, Daniel lingered more and more in his office or left for meetings. Alice tried not to ask too many questions, knowing it would only irritate him. He was always immersed in his own affairs, even when he was at home. Their evenings together were reduced to silent watching TV, sometimes accompanied by a couple of duty phrases. One evening, as Alice walked to the mailbox, she noticed the neighbor, Lucas. He had just moved into their neighborhood a few months ago, but they hadn't really socialized yet. Lucas was a tall, sturdy man with a slight smile and a look full of liveliness. Unlike her husband, Lucas always seemed open and friendly. "Hi, Alice," he said, casting a slight glance in her direction as she crossed the yard. "How are you doing?" She was a little embarrassed, but answered, trying not to show her excitement. "I'm fine, thanks, Lucas. How are you doing?" Their brief exchange of phrases lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough to make Alice feel something new. When she got home, her thoughts suddenly returned to Lucas. It was a strange feeling, the first time in a long time that someone had shown genuine interest in her. Not as Daniel's wife, not as a housewife, but just as a person. In his eyes, she saw the attention that had been missing from her life for so long. Each day, Alice became more and more immersed in her inner turmoil. She continued to play the role of the perfect wife, pretending that everything was fine. She smiled at meetings with her friends, told them about the little things in life, but inside, she felt it was all hollow. As she cooked dinner, stirring soup or roasting vegetables on automatic, her thoughts returned to Lucas, to his warm smile and easy jokes. As the weeks passed, their chance encounters became more frequent. They crossed paths on the street, in front of stores, in the park. Lucas always had something to say, and Alice responded with a warmth she hadn't felt in her marriage in a long time. She couldn't understand why she was so drawn to him, but the guilt was slowly receding into the background. Her life, the one she'd built over the years, suddenly seemed foreign. Next to Lucas, she felt alive again. One evening, when Daniel was late for another business meeting, Alice stood at the window, watching the sunset. Her thoughts were once again occupied with Lucas. She remembered how he had suggested that she go for a walk a couple days ago. It had been such an innocent suggestion, but she knew there was something more behind it. Alice looked at the empty house, at the pictures, at the mess she had created in her head. "Maybe I'm just tired," she whispered to herself, trying to convince herself that her feelings were a temporary loneliness-induced mental clouding. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next day, Alice met Lucas again as she was leaving the store. He was standing by his car, talking to someone on the phone, but when he saw her, he ended the conversation immediately. "Alice, it's good to see you." His smile was so genuine that her heart shook for a moment. "Hi, Lucas. How are you?" She tried to speak casually, but she felt a slight shiver inside her. "I'm great. How about we go out tomorrow night? I know a nice place not too far from here." The question caught her off guard. She froze, trying to figure out what to say. But the memory of the empty house and Daniel's cold kisses came to mind. "Sounds great," she said before she could think about what she'd said. And from that moment on, her life began to change slowly but steadily. Alice stood at the mirror, adjusting the light summer hat she'd worn for their meeting. Her hands were shaking, and she could hardly concentrate on her appearance. Every time she thought about what she was doing now, a panic attack hit her. Along with that panic, however, another stronger emotion filled her heart: anticipation. Over the past weeks, her and Lucas's meetings had become more frequent, but also more dangerous. They made time for each other in between the mundane tasks of everyday life. Sometimes it was innocent walks in the park, where no one knew them as husband and wife of other people. Sometimes it was long conversations outside his house before the neighbors could notice them. But behind each of these moments was a growing passion that was literally tearing her apart. One day, Alice met Lucas in an abandoned parking lot near the woods. It was one of those places where no one asked questions, no one paid attention. She saw his car from a distance, her heart started beating faster, and her legs seemed to move on their own. "Hi," she said, stepping closer, trying to hide her excitement. Lucas got out of the car and a warm smile appeared on his face. "I missed you." He stepped closer and Alice felt her breathing quicken. He was so confident, so calm, that Alice forgot everything in his presence. She knew what they were doing was wrong. But around him, her feelings came alive, as if someone had brought color back into her gray life. They talked about nonsense, exchanged light jokes, and laughed like teenagers. But every time his hand accidentally touched hers, she sensed an underlying subtext in it that they both avoided. That tension built up with each time they met, until one day it reached a boiling point. That evening, Lucas suggested that Alice take a walk in the woods. The trees stood tall walls on the sides of the path, creating a sense of solitude. The nature around them was quiet and peaceful, but inside Alice was seething. They were silent, walking side by side, and everything seemed to hang in this strange and dangerous moment. Stopping in a small open area, they turned to each other. Alice, feeling her inner tension rising, decided to say something to lighten the atmosphere, but she didn't have time. Lucas stepped forward and touched her face gently. "You know I can't do this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You can if you want to," he said quietly, but with obvious confidence. He moved closer, and Alice couldn't resist anymore. The next moment, their lips came together in a kiss, full of hidden passion that had been hiding inside for a long time. This kiss was like opening the door to a new world, where everything that had gone before, her long and joyless marriage, the endless routine, disappeared. All that remained was them, their feelings, their desire to be with each other. After that kiss, their relationship moved to a new level. Now they met more and more often, and each meeting became more and more intimate. They spent time in secret places, trying not to attract attention. Alice felt her heart fill with life. Lucas gave her what she lacked: warmth, passion, and attention. But along with that came a sense of danger. She knew that continuing these encounters could destroy everything: her marriage, her reputation, her family. Daniel suspected nothing, but Alice was increasingly afraid that one day he would find out. She had panic attacks every time she and Lucas said goodbye. She was afraid that someone would see them, that someone would start asking questions. "We have to be more careful," Alice said once when she and Lucas met again in the park. He nodded, but there wasn't a shadow of worry in his eyes. "No one will know anything. I've got it under control," he said, with the same confidence that always reassured Alice. But her inner voice kept telling her they were playing with fire. The more they met, the harder it was to hide their feelings. Alice was starting to get confused about what she was doing. She would come home and try to act like nothing had changed, but Daniel was starting to notice her changes. He would ask why she was absent so often, and her explanations became less and less convincing. One evening, when Alice came home later than usual, Daniel met her on the doorstep with a serious expression on his face. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice calm but with a slight note of suspicion. Alice froze. She hadn't expected him to ask that question, and her heart pounded harder. "I just stopped by to see a friend. We were running a little late," she answered quickly, trying to sound confident. Daniel nodded silently and went into his office, leaving her alone with a pang of guilt. She realized that his suspicions were growing, and that one mistake could spell disaster. The meetings with Lucas continued, but now they were accompanied by a constant feeling that something could go wrong. Alice became more cautious, coming up with increasingly elaborate excuses for her absences. She checked her phone for messages, afraid that Daniel might have noticed something. Each new message from Lucas made her both excited and scared at the same time. One night, when they met in the same abandoned parking lot, Alice couldn't contain her emotions. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "It's too dangerous. We could ruin everything." Lucas, as usual, remained calm. "It's going to be okay, Alice, I promise. No one will find out." He took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. His confidence always reassured her, but this time the fear was stronger. "What if they find out?" Her voice trembled. "I can't lose everything I have." Lucas moved closer and kissed her softly. "No one will find out if we're careful," he repeated. Those words gave her strength again, but inside she knew their time might be limited. With each passing day, the tension grew, and Alice began to feel their affair turning into something more dangerous. She realized that it was no longer possible to stop. But to continue at this pace also meant approaching imminent collapse. One day, when they met in a secluded place, Alice felt that the tension between them had reached a peak. Their passion was growing stronger and stronger, but with it came a growing sense that this could all end in disaster. She tried to reassure herself, believing Lucas's words, but her anxiety didn't subside. They kissed again, and in that moment, Alice felt something change. Their romance was no longer just a passionate adventure. It was something more, something that threatened to ruin her life. The sky over the small town had clouded over, and the cold wind seemed to portend something ominous. Alice left the house a little later than usual to meet Lucas at their usual spot, on the edge of the park. Anxiety gripped her from the inside out, as if something had subtly changed in their lives over the past few days. Her hands trembled as she tried to brush her hair carelessly, but it was no use. Fear and a premonition of impending disaster pressed on her heart. She walked along the deserted streets, feeling her anxiety growing. Her mind drifted back and forth to Daniel, who was acting more and more suspicious. He seemed to notice her distance and began to watch her actions more closely, asking more questions to which she had no convincing answers. By the time Alice reached their secret location, the park had already begun to sink into a dark twilight. The air was damp, smelling of foliage and something cloying. She expected to see Lucas's car in the same spot where they usually met, but the parking lot was empty. Alice looked around, trying to find any sign of him, but nothing indicated his presence. All sorts of scenarios flashed through her mind. Maybe he was late for work, or caught in traffic. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed his number, but no one answered. A few minutes passed, and Alice began to panic. His absence seemed strange. He was usually always punctual, always trying to arrive first to avoid unnecessary attention. "Where are you?" she whispered, looking around. Something dark flickered among the trees, catching her attention. Alice's heart sank when she saw the familiar silhouette of Lucas's car standing in the distance. beyond the edge of the forest path. She headed there with a quick step, her breathing quickening and a chill running down her spine. As she approached the car, she felt a strange silence around her. Everything seemed suspiciously quiet, as if the world had frozen in anticipation of something terrible. Alice opened the car door, and inside she saw Lucas. He was lying on the seat, his face turned to the side and his eyes open. At first, she thought he was just sleeping, but something about his stillness made her sense that something was wrong with him. Her breathing hitched. Her heart began to pound frantically in her chest. "Lucas?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't answer. Alice leaned closer, and only then noticed the blood on his chest soaking through his shirt. A momentary shock stiffened her body and she froze, unable to believe what she was seeing in front of her. The world around her seemed to disappear, all sounds muffled, and her mind plunged into the void. No, this can't be true." She felt her body begin to tremble. Alice stepped back, nearly falling, her hands clenched into fists. Tears filled her eyes, panic gripping her mind. Lucas was dead. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had killed him. Her legs shook, and her thoughts jumbled in her head. What should she do now? Should she tell the police? But if she told everything, their affair would be exposed, and then her life, her family's life, would be ruined. She couldn't let that happen. Through her panic, Alice sprang into action. She pulled out her cell phone, but couldn't bring herself to dial the number. Her fingers trembled so violently that the phone fell out of her hands, hitting the ground with a thud. She bent down, picked it up, and looked again at Lucas's motionless body. Shit! Her breathing became ragged. She couldn't breathe. For a minute, she thought this was a nightmare, that she was about to wake up and everything would be okay. But reality was merciless. Lucas was dead, and she didn't know what to do next. Suddenly, she was overwhelmed by the thought that someone might have seen them. Someone might have known about her encounters with Lucas. Panic swept over her with renewed vigor. She couldn't stay here, but she couldn't just leave. Suddenly, the phone in her hand rang. Alice flinched and looked at the screen. It was Daniel calling. Her heart skipped a beat. "Hello," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady even though everything was boiling inside. "Where are you?" Daniel's voice was calm, but with a hint of suspicion. "It's late. You should have been back a long time ago. I went over to Emma's. We were just sitting, talking," Alice lied, not believing her own words. "Emma called a few minutes ago, asking where you were." "Something doesn't add up, Alice." A cold wariness came into his voice. Alice froze. The lie was coming at her like an avalanche, and she didn't know how to get out of it. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like Daniel could hear it through the phone. "I'm going home," she said quickly, cutting off the conversation. Then she dropped the phone into her pocket and looked at Lucas's body again. The fear for herself, for her life, became stronger than the pain of loss. Everything that was happening was unreal. She looked around, her mind trying to find a way out of this nightmare. Her head was spinning with thoughts, each one only making the situation worse. Alice knew she couldn't leave so easily, but she also realized that every minute in this place increased her chances of being seen. Not knowing what to do, she paused for a moment, trying to calm herself. Lucas's body, so still, seemed to scream his final pain. Her own helplessness and guilt began to overwhelm her. Alice took one last look at him and, swallowing, quickly ran away from the car, away from this scene. When Alice got home, she tried to act normal, but every second was agony for her. Her head was buzzing, panic gripping her. She was afraid to meet Daniel's eyes, afraid he would sense something wrong. But he didn't ask any more questions, just stared at her in silence while she nervously fixed her hair and tried not to let her anxiety show. A few days passed, and the news of Lucas's death spread through the town. The official version was assault or robbery. However, Alice knew it wasn't that simple. A feeling was growing inside her that someone knew about their relationship, that their affair had been exposed. But the strangest thing of all was Daniel's behavior. He expressed no anger or suspicion, though he clearly felt something. Sometimes he spoke to her affectionately, comforting her when Alice tried to feign shock at her neighbor's death. but sometimes there was a wariness in his gaze, a coldness that frightened her more than anything else. Not a week later, Detective Trevor Miller came into play. His appearance was the beginning of the official investigation. Trevor was experienced, and his intuition immediately suggested that Lucas's death was not a simple robbery, but something darker. He began by canvassing the neighborhood, including Alice and Daniel. Alice felt a web of suspicion begin to weave around her. Detective Trevor asked too many questions. His gaze was too attentive. She realized that with each passing minute, their mystery was getting closer to being solved. Now, every day for Alice was full of fear. She was tormented by thoughts. Who killed Lucas? Why? And most importantly, what to do now? The sky, gray and heavy as if foreboding an approaching storm, was weighing down on the city. There was a tense silence in the air, as if the town had frozen in anticipation of something inevitable. Alice couldn't remember the last time she had felt calm. Every day was like a horrible dream in which she could no longer distinguish reality from imaginary threats. After Lucas's death, everything had changed. She could barely control herself, trying not to give away her emotions in front of Daniel and the children. But the feeling that someone was watching her every move never left her for a moment, especially as Detective Trevor Miller dug deeper and deeper into their lives, asking questions that kept her on edge. It started with simple interrogations. Miller seemed polite and friendly, but his eyes were always wary, as if he was searching for something hidden behind Alice's words. She tried her best to act natural, but with each visit from the detective, her fears increased. One day, Miller came again. This time he asked to speak alone with Daniel, and Alice couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. She sat in the kitchen, pretending to eat dinner, but every word of their conversation reached her ears. "You knew Lucas well, didn't you?" Miller asked, his voice flat, but there was an undercurrent. "We were neighbors," Daniel answered, averting his gaze. "Sometimes we crossed paths, but not much more than that." "That's odd," the detective continued, pausing to consider his next move. "You don't have any idea why he was killed? Any conflicts you might have known about?" Daniel frowned, pretending to ponder. Alice held her breath, waiting for his answer. "I haven't heard of any conflicts," he finally answered. Lucas had always seemed like a quiet guy. It could very well have been a robbery, like they say on the news. Miller nodded, but the look that slid across Daniel's face made Alice feel a new surge of anxiety. She knew the detective wasn't just listening, he was analyzing every movement, every intonation. When the conversation ended, Alice could no longer contain her tension. She ran out of the kitchen, finding Daniel on the veranda, where he was nervously taking a smoke break. "What did he want?" she asked quietly, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "Same as always," Daniel answered, a tiredness in his voice. "Asking about Lucas. This whole thing is driving me crazy already." "You didn't say anything to him?" "Of course not." He threw the cigarette on the ground and crushed it with his foot. "Alice, are you doubting me?" She froze, feeling his words sink into her heart. At that moment, she wanted to believe him more than anything, but something in his behavior began to seem suspicious to her. He became more withdrawn, aloof, and though Daniel tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, Alice sensed he was hiding something. At night, Alice couldn't sleep. Thoughts of Lucas, Daniel, and Detective Miller kept her awake. What if Daniel already knew? Or worse, what if he was involved in Lucas's murder? But why? She couldn't find an answer, and her mind was consumed with doubts and fears. The next day, Miller arrived again, this time with a whole team of investigators. They collected statements not only from the Graysons, but from the neighbors as well. The questions became more and more specific, and there seemed to be no detail of their lives that wasn't being examined. Miller questioned Emma, Alice's closest friend. When Alice found out, she realized that the investigation was starting to get more and more personal. Emma, of course, knew nothing about her secret liaison with Lucas, but the very thought that someone might uncover it was unbearable. "You were in contact with Alice the night before the murder, weren't you?" Miller asked Emma, his eyes following her every move. "Yeah, we met. She came by my house." Emma raised her eyebrows slightly, surprised by the question. "What's this about?" "Just checking. Did she mention anything about Lucas? Did she say she'd seen him recently?" Emma hesitated a moment and answered, "No, I don't remember. We talked about family and stuff, but I didn't notice anything like that." Miller nodded, but his face remained tense. When Emma left the detective's office, she immediately called Alice to report the interrogation. "Are they starting to suspect something?" Alice asked nervously. "I don't think so," her friend reassured her. "But be careful. Trevor wasn't the kind of man to give up halfway through." Alice couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Each new move Miller made seemed a step closer to uncovering her secret. She locked herself in the bathroom more and more often to calm down and consider what to do next. But fear of exposure wasn't her only problem. More and more often she remembered the odd little things about Daniel. His sudden late-night phone calls, for example, his frequent absences on business, which had become suspiciously frequent since Lucas's death. She'd never asked too many questions, but now she was beginning to notice things she'd overlooked before. Miller, continuing his investigation, began digging deeper into Daniel's past. It turned out that his business had fallen on hard times, and some old partners had a beef with him. This discovery added fuel to the fire. Daniel had a possible motive for murder. "Were you having financial problems?" Miller asked me directly during another interrogation. "Every business has its difficulties," Daniel answered evasively, trying to keep his composure. "But this has nothing to do with Lucas." "Are you sure?" Miller stared at him. "Lucas was known to have money. Could you have had a falling out with him over that?" Daniel frowned, but quickly pulled himself together. It was a nice theory, but it had nothing to do with reality. Alice sat in the other room, listening to their conversation through the ajar door. Her heart was beating fast. Miller was right. Money had always been the cause of quarrels in their family. But had she ever imagined Daniel would dare to do such a thing? Every day her suspicions grew stronger. Now she wasn't sure she knew her husband anymore. Miller continued to squeeze the ring around them, and it seemed like the truth was about to come out. But if Daniel had really killed Lucas, then did he know something? Perhaps he'd uncovered their affair sooner than she'd realized. Alice couldn't confirm it, but one thought kept her in suspense. Her husband could be a real monster. The tension in the Grayson household was reaching a fever pitch. Alice was increasingly withdrawn, afraid to say a word. Daniel was distant, but his eyes were troubled. In the evenings they hardly spoke at all, only silently at dinner, avoiding each other's gazes. Meanwhile, Miller never left them alone. His interrogations became more and more rigid, and his questions more and more specific. Alice realized that soon their lies would come out. Each new encounter with the detective increased her fear, but also revealed more and more secrets in which she herself had nearly drowned. The gloomy morning was barely engaged on the horizon when Detective Trevor Miller finally had all the data he needed to complete his investigation. This was the day he was going to close the case. Alice had been living like a powder keg for weeks now, waiting for an explosion. Anxiety, fear, and a sense of the inevitable haunted her every minute. Daniel, though he tried to remain calm, was increasingly distant, his nervousness visible to those around him. Miller felt it was time to reveal the truth. In all these weeks, he hadn't missed a single detail. Every move, every conversation, every contradiction. There were too many threads in this case that connected people seemingly uninvolved. But one thread led to Daniel himself. Alice was sitting in the kitchen, mechanically stirring her coffee, when Miller pulled up in front of their house. The noise of the engine made her wince. She knew this visit would change everything. The detective entered the house without knocking, determinedly, as if he already felt like he owned the place. Daniel met him on the doorstep, trying to keep his composure. "Detective, you with the questions again?" he said, trying to hide the tension. Miller nodded, but his gaze was as cold as ice. He looked around the room slowly, then shifted his gaze to Alice, who stood at the stove. "Yes, questions," Miller said, taking a seat at the kitchen table. "But this time, Daniel, I already know the answers." Alice felt her heart sink. Daniel tensed, his gaze becoming wary, but he tried to remain calm. "What are you talking about?" he asked, smiling weakly. "About Lucas," Miller said quietly, but his words sounded like a thunderclap. "About your wife, and what happened that night." The kitchen fell into an ominous silence. Alice couldn't move, her breathing hitched, and the world around her seemed to shrink to the size of that small room. She knew her secret was out, and she couldn't even imagine what would happen next. "What, Lucas?" Daniel tried to remain calm, but there was worry in his voice. Miller sighed, like a man preparing to reveal his cards. "Daniel," he began, "I know you killed Lucas. I know about your suspicions, the way you've been following him. You found out about his relationship with Alice, and that was the final straw." Alice turned sharply toward the detective, her gaze frozen on his face. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're lying," she shouted, trying to find support in her own words. "He couldn't! Daniel, tell him it's not true!" But Daniel remained silent. His face remained cold, as if frozen in a mask of indifference. Miller kept his eyes on him as he continued his thought. "You've been hiding it for a long time. But you know how it is? The truth always comes out no matter how cleverly you try to hide it." "This is ridiculous," Daniel wheezed, his voice filled with barely contained rage. "You're accusing me of murder? Just based on suspicion?" "Not just based on suspicion." Miller stood up from the table and pulled documents out of a folder. "We found your fingerprints on Lucas's neck. You forgot that night left a trail. You were too consumed with anger to notice it." Alice slumped back in his chair. Miller's words penetrated her like cold blades. Fingerprints? Could it really be true? Had her husband killed a man because he'd found out about her affair? "I didn't mean to," Daniel spoke suddenly, his voice sounding hoarse and depressed. "I just wanted to talk to him. He took you away from me, Alice. You were my wife, and he—" Miller listened intently, letting Daniel continue. "I knew you two were dating. I didn't want to believe it at first, but then it became obvious. Those late returns, your aloofness. I'd been watching you, and that night, I just wanted to figure it out." Alice covered her face with her hands. She couldn't listen anymore, but she knew it was only just beginning. "When I went to see him," Daniel continued, his voice trailing off, "he was calm, even cocky calm. Said you were together and that he wasn't going to let you go. We had a fight, and I couldn't take it. I grabbed him by the throat. At first I just tried to stop him, to shut him up, but then it got out of control." Miller watched the killer's confession in silence. Alice, choking on her emotions, couldn't believe what was happening. It was all because of her. The affair that seemed to be her salvation had turned out to be a tragedy for everyone. "You could have just left," Alice whispered, her voice weak. "You could have ended it all and walked away." "I couldn't," Daniel replied, his eyes full of despair. "I couldn't lose you." Silence covered the room again. Alice looked at her husband with pain and horror. The man she had once loved had turned out to be a monster, willing to kill for the sake of her jealousy. But all that had happened wasn't all his fault. Her choices had led to this catastrophe too. Miller finally stepped forward and pulled out his handcuffs. "Daniel Grayson, you're under arrest for the murder of Lucas Harris." His voice was cold and officially impassive. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law." Daniel didn't resist. He only cast one last look at Alice, a look of despair and bitterness. And in that moment, she realized that their lives would never be the same. Everything had crumbled in one night. Their family, their marriage, her illusion of love. Detective Miller watched the police officers take Daniel away, feeling a growing sense of finality. This was one of those cases that leave a mark on the soul. Jealousy, pain, betrayal, all mixed up in this story, and now fate had torn another family apart. Alice stood alone on the doorstep of her house, staring after the police car as it drove away. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just stood there in silence, realizing that her life was now ruined. Lucas was dead, her husband was a murderer, and she was left with an emptiness inside. The past was impossible to change. Mistakes, betrayals, and lies had ripped her life to shreds. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She no longer cared what the neighbors thought of her. The only thing that mattered was that she had lost everyone she had ever loved. The final truth had come out into the light, and now nothing could bring her back to her old life. It had been months since Daniel had been convicted of Lucas Harris's murder. Alice sat in the empty house, surrounded by the silence that had become her constant companion. The world around her had crumbled like a house of cards collapsing after one bad move. Now she was alone, completely alone, and that loneliness was unbearable. After the trial, everything that had once made up her life was rapidly disappearing. People she thought were friends turned away from her, refused to socialize, and avoided her gaze. No one wanted to deal with a woman whose adultery had led to tragedy. Word spread quickly in the small town, and no one wanted to support someone whose mistake led to the death of one man and the condemnation of another. At first, she'd hoped it was all temporary, that people would change their minds, but then it became clear. Everyone was gone, and there would be no turning back. In the beginning, she was still invited to the police interrogations, and every time she returned home, Alice felt as if exhausted, as if another piece of her soul had been ripped out irrevocably. But now that the investigation was over and the verdict was in, life had returned to its new, empty rhythm. She lost her job. The local school, where Alice was a primary school teacher, could not withstand the pressure from parents. No one wanted their children to be taught by a woman who had tarnished her reputation with such a scandal. Alice tried for a long time to understand when it all became a real nightmare, but the memories merged into one painful blur. Her life before meeting Lucas now seemed distant and non-existent, like an illusion. Only her home remained, but even that last island of stability was soon lost. Alice couldn't afford to pay the mortgage anymore, especially after she lost her job. One by one, the bills piled up, and the calls from the bank became more and more insistent. She no longer left the house, preferring to avoid the prying eyes and whispers that always followed her outside. Even her neighbors, once friendly, now looked at her with resentment and judgment. Her family, too, had turned their backs on her. Her mother and father, when they learned of her adultery and what it had led to, could not support her. They only said that she should have done the right thing, not gotten involved in the affair, not destroyed her family and her husband's life. Their words, full of judgment, finally drove Alice away from everyone she knew. One morning, when she woke up, Alice realized she had nothing more to lose. She walked around the empty rooms of her house, which now stood as lifeless as herself. There were unpacked boxes in the kitchen. She was being evicted in a week. In the living room, all the curtains were drawn tightly, hiding her from the outside world. The room seemed empty, and that emptiness was unbearably painful. The only place where Alice found even the faintest comfort was the cemetery. She went there every day, in all kinds of weather, to visit Lucas's grave. No one else visited him. His family lived far away, and his friends avoided the place, afraid to remember what had happened. But for Alice, it had become a ritual to come, to stand, to try to find some connection to the man who had caused her life to go down the drain. Today was a particularly gray day. The sky was frowning, about to rain, but Alice walked down the familiar path to Lucas's grave anyway. In her hands, she held a bouquet of wilted flowers she'd found at home. They were as dead as her feelings, as dead as her life. As Alice stopped at the grave, her gaze lingered on the plaque with his name on it. Lucas Harris. A simple name, a simple life that ended in such a horrible way. She couldn't figure out if she'd really loved him. Their affair had started so suddenly, she'd barely had time to realize where it was going. "You were just an escape from the emptiness," she whispered, staring at the cold stone. "Or did I really love you?" It didn't matter now. The words drowned in the wind that was beginning to gather strength. Alice stood looking at the grave and felt her thoughts growing heavier and heavier. She wondered more and more. Had it been worth it? Was her romance worth the sacrifices it had made? Or was it just a moment of weakness that had destroyed everything around her? Alyssa stared at Lucas's grave, feeling her whole life rolling downhill. She didn't know if it was love or just a desire to escape reality, but her affair with Lucas had destroyed everything she had. "You were a lifesaver," she whispered. But was it worth it? Her words were drowned out by the deafening sound of the wind. Heavy clouds hung over the cemetery, ready to rain. Alice suddenly felt that she was no longer afraid, not afraid of the judgmental stares, the silence of the empty house, the pain of loneliness. She no longer felt anything but desolation. Her gaze lingered on one of the trees nearby. The branches of an old oak tree hung over the ground, Sturdy, thick, each one strong enough to support her weight. The thought crashed into her mind like a final decision that required no thought. Alice stepped closer to the tree, her breathing becoming rapid, but she felt it was the only way. She removed her belt, carefully testing its strength, and tied it around the branch. Everything was happening as if in a fog. Every detail was clearly visible, but reality seemed distant, unimportant. She made a loop and threw it around her neck. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind was surprisingly calm. Alice looked up at the sky, heavy, gray, like her own soul. Lucas's grave seemed like the last link between her and the world that had now turned its back on her. "Maybe here I'll find peace," she whispered, taking one last step forward. Her body hung in the air for a moment, and everything went silent.